Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Directions Mag Geospatial webinar, today sponsored by our friends at ROK Tech. Thank you to the geospatial community for being loyal to us for 25 years. You can read more at directionsmag.com. Welcome back to Alex Coleman. She is CEO of ROK Technologies, and she brought her friend Chris Chiriatti with her today from Deloitte. And so we are excited to hear their insights on cloud spending and making good decisions in that regard. So, Alex, welcome back. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, it's great to be back. And thank you, all of you who are joining us virtually today for this really cool topic, whether it be the migration piece or the ongoing costs. This is a really hot topic out there. And we reached out to Chris Chiriatti at Deloitte, and he was gracious enough to bring his insight to this conversation today. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris so he can give us all some really good ideas on the best way to approach this hot topic. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for joining today. And I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so providing sort of an accounting perspective. So I'm an accountant by nature. My name's Chris Chiriatti, work in Deloitte's National Office Accounting Reporting Services Group. So I deal with technical accounting. So I deal with this from the financial reporting standpoint, and really going to provide some perspectives on how we see the accounting literature applying to these. And that's ultimately what any finance organization is going to be evaluating the spend against, is the in-place accounting literature that's going to dictate whether or not certain costs get to be recorded as an asset on the balance sheet or just an expense in the P&L. And that's sort of the differentiation between operating expense or capital expense. We do want this to be as interactive as possible for the audience. So there is a chat feature. Please submit your questions. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end. We can address some questions that come in, because we want to make sure that we're presenting relevant content. But we'll spend the bulk of the time just kind of walking through and really the accounting and demystifying some of the things that are out there. So I do want to start kind of at the top and just really provide an overview of what the accounting literature is trying to do. And there's words on the slide with references to specific accounting codification. That's relevant for the finance org, because ultimately that's what they'll have to demonstrate to their auditors, which is that would be me in some cases, because I'm an auditor by trade, on how to justify the accounting. But really, what we're trying to do is differentiate instances where a company is really developing an asset that they own and control versus buying a service. And cloud at its highest, it's using someone else's infrastructure. It's using a hyperscaler's hardware to provide compute capacity and storage. But that really oversimplifies the nature of a lot of these arrangements. And really, what we're trying to do is, with all these cloud migrations, is what the entity's doing is, are they really just building their own asset in the cloud, or are they really spending a lot of money to ultimately buy something that is going to be considered a service? And all of that really focuses on how we would think about what, if any, control an entity has over the technology that's deployed in the cloud. At the highest level, if we look at it and say, well, from a legal standpoint, rights standpoint, the company still owns that technology. They made the choice to move it to the cloud. They're using someone else's processing power to operate the technology, taking advantage of some of the scalability and elasticity that cloud avails. But it's still their asset. That's going to take us down one path, differentiating that from instances where really technology is being accessed from the cloud, but that technology, the underlying intellectual property, the software, is still owned by the cloud provider or the vendor, and the company accessing it does not have the ability to take it off the cloud, move it to a different provider, and really loses control of what that instance is. Well, then those are the types of arrangements that we're going to say, really are a service. And those are two very different accounting frameworks, because from an accounting standpoint, if you're building an asset, even if you're building it in someone else's environment, then that is still CapEx. If you're really just provisioning a service, even if you have a lot of the same implementation activities, a lot of the same types of costs, then a service model is an operating expense. The accounting literature doesn't allow for capitalization of services. You can defer as a prepaid, so there is an element that gets ultimately put up on the balance sheet. But the ultimate accounting model for a service contract is very different than the accounting model for acquiring or building an asset. And that's really fundamentally what we're trying to differentiate. So the other things that we've identified here on this slide is just kind of the different scoping considerations, because even with a cloud migration or moving to the cloud, there could be a variety of different components. There could be, software as a service, which is just taking software directly, the functionality of software right from the cloud, to platform and infrastructure as a service, where now you're starting to use with infrastructure, it's just the hardware. Platform, it's hardware and certain core capabilities that then we're going to build software on. And it's really important to understand what aspect that is, and of equal importance, what the cost is going to relate to, because any costs that we think are really just purely associated with software as a service, well then, whether it's paid up front, incurred up front, that's really only benefit is going to be something that we think is just native SaaS, only accessible in the cloud. Well, that's when we're going to get to OpEx. As we step down and think more about platform and infrastructure as a service, we're still going to have to carve out what we think are costs associated with a pure service, because those still wouldn't be applicable for capitalization. But we'd have to then also similarly identify what cost really results in me building my asset. What is the cost around associating with the core software that's being moved in the cloud? And that's what ultimately we'd identify as eligible for capitalization. The devil's in the detail, and there's a lot of challenges, and it's really hard to just blanketly say everything's in one bucket or another. So in a lot of instances, what we would do, whether we're advising or auditing companies who are investing in cloud-enabled technology, is we're first assessing the scope of the arrangement. What are the different things that are going on? And what are the different levers that a company has pulled, that a vendor has pulled, that could influence the rights that either counterparty has with regards to the underlying technology? And again, it's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all bucket, because you might have cloud migrations that have certain software that is truly provisioned in the cloud, that is SaaS native, but it's relying on or dependent on and interacting with other software that's sitting in the cloud that the company might still have a license to, that they think they have optionality of what that is. And identifying what each of those components are, kind of the unit of account, if you're focused on the second bullet, each one of those can garner a slightly different functionality or different accounting treatment. With regards to functionality, one thing that's important in the movement to the cloud, and this is the way the accounting framework is established, is to start capitalizing costs. Then you really have to be adding functionality. And the reason that's important is it's a fundamental model in accounting for assets, is if you own an asset and you're just doing something to maintain an asset, then that maintenance cost really isn't adding value to the asset. It's required to really just maintain the life of the asset. However, if you're doing something to enhance the asset, allowing it to do something it hasn't done before, well then really you're creating an asset that is different than the one that you originally had. If we transfer that into the notion of software, really what we're looking for is there functionality being added as things are moving to the cloud? Because then it really is creating a new asset. If it's just a pure, what's sometimes referred to as a replatforming of a piece of software, but no functionality is being added, well, the asset that you had in your own environment is really the same asset that you had in a cloud environment. It's not creating new assets. There's not a basis to capitalizing those costs. So one of the things we're looking for is added functionality that's going to be created as a result of moving the asset to the cloud. And it's once we get to that point where there's functionality being added and we think we've got an asset that we can move to the cloud, we're looking at all costs. So it's not just third-party costs. It's not just direct costs that we can identify. It's internal and external costs that we think we can reasonably allocate or attribute to this asset that's being created in the cloud. And that even goes to the point of some of the cost associated with the infrastructure, whether it's infrastructure or platforms as a service, not referred to as just a hosting cost. If there's certain hosting fees that are being incurred, and the only reason those are being incurred is because we're creating this asset in the cloud. It's not live, it's not in a production environment. It's really, a core cost that's needed to be incurred to build this new asset in the cloud. Well, that gets thrown into the bucket of capitalization. That's one of the areas, where we do see opportunities to capitalize some of the hosting costs, which is, I'll get to the next slide, is one of the myths. But anytime we're moving something to the cloud and we have existing assets, we always need to think about too, what's the impact of the assets that are left behind? There's certain assumptions inherent in a company's financial statements with regards to the life of any assets being capitalized. And if there's a pre-existing software asset that's being moved to the cloud, there's going to need to be some considerations with regards to what happened to that asset. Is it something that I just moved? Am I sort of just taking this asset and moving to the cloud, or did I abandon it because I created something that's completely different? So it's always important to think about the tag-along effects of moving to the cloud and what it can do to any assets that are left behind. There's a handful of common myths that we hear when it's relating to cloud migrations. And right out of the gate, I think people tend to jump to, well, it's all OpEx. Everything is going to be OpEx because I'm moving to the cloud, and that's a service. And I think there's broad recognition that there's costs that can be deferred. This is something that the accounting standards were updated a number of years ago for cloud implementation, that you can defer costs. So if an entity is let's say hypothetically spending $500,000 to implement a pure cloud solution, but it hasn't gone live yet, well, those costs, even if it's ultimately determined to be a service contract, can be deferred, but those will come through as operating expenses when they're ultimately recognized in any of these financial statements. But the myth is that all costs are always going to be OpEx. And as you see on the fact slide here, the fact side of the slide is there's going to tends to be some assets that qualify as what's considered internal use software. So that's sort of the buzzword from an accounting standpoint of what we're looking for, that there'll be internal use software that's ultimately going to result in some capitalization. The trick is identifying each of those individual units of account, if you think back one of the bullets on the prior slide, and making sure that we're properly identifying all the different software components that are moving to the cloud, and what are the company's retained rights with regards to those. Because if a company has a true legal license to the underlying code, not just a license that might be embedded in a SaaS arrangement, but a true underlying license to the code, and has the ability to dictate which SaaS provider or which hosting provider that license is sitting at, then that's still going to be what the accounting guidance identifies as internal use software. And that's where we're going to start identifying those costs that are going to be capitalized associated with that. Another myth is all hosting fees or expenses incurred. And as I just said, when you're moving software to the cloud and you've identified software that still qualifies as internal use software, then we're looking for all of the costs that are required to get that software into the cloud, as long as we've identified enhancements to the functionality. So we're creating that new asset in the cloud. And once we get there, we're looking for all of the costs, including hosting fees, that are going to be incurred in connection with that migration, and capitalizing that as part of the asset. So that brings me to the next myth that said there's nothing that can be accomplished during the contracting that can impact the accounting. Here's where provisions matter. Because if you think about the framework that I talked about and trying to differentiate an asset from a service, a key part of identifying an asset and differentiating it from the service is the control that the company has over that asset, the ability to take that software and optionality of where it's going to host it. So there's, we'd want to the extent it's possible, to make sure that from a contracting standpoint, that a company is retaining the rights of ownership of the underlying software, as opposed to relinquishing that to some vendor that's hosting it and delivering that software service, through the cloud. Another thing that we're seeing some of, but not much, is getting to an underlying lease, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But there's some structures in a completely different accounting framework where if you have dedicated hardware, you might ultimately get to a point where even if that hardware is sitting in someone else's data center, from an accounting standpoint, that hardware might be owned by the customer, and ultimately resulting as if it is sitting on-prem in its internal use software. One final myth, which probably isn't the answer people like, but it's something that we've heard marketed out there, is reserved instances of cloud computing capacity as an intangible asset. That is also a myth. So just prepaying for cloud or having reserved instances, even if that instance is exchangeable in a marketplace, doesn't qualify as an intangible asset. It's still a service contract, and that in its nature would be a service cost that would be OpEx and not CapEx. On the last slide, I just briefly want to touch on leasing. A lot of words on this slide. Certainly not enough time to digest them all, but there are going to be certain limited hosting contracts that contain a lease. These are going to be limited to instances where there's a core asset that's identified, a physical server that is specifically identified, single tenant environment, and that server is dedicated to a customer. And the only way that server ever operates is when the customer who's accessing it in the hosting environment calls on it for whatever that data, whatever the server's doing, whether it's storage, compute capacity, processing minutes. That's what's referred to as dispatch rights. So, we would say an entity has all the economic benefits associated with that, and then also has the right to direct the use of it because they are able to determine basically through those dispatch rights when the server's off or when it's on. We don't see a lot of that, but that is another model out there. Can be important during the contracting practice. So just wanted to make the group aware that it's an option in some instances, but it's not something that we see a ton of prevalence on. So time flies when you're having fun, and we're just about the bottom of the presentation, but I do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. Observe that a question that I often get is, is there anything that I can tell my finance department that's going to let them know that this is eligible to be capitalizable? The short answer is no. There's no silver bullet here. The devil's in the detail. But I think it's important for finance organizations to be, one, at least open-minded to, how the accounting framework should be applied at a level of detail that it needs to be applied to truly unlock what can be and should be capitalized. This is an odd area of the literature where if you don't have the detail, you actually default to expense, which is entirely permissible. So sometimes it takes a level of effort to get under the hood and understand what's happening and develop a robust process to identify those costs that should be capitalized. And that's what we'd be looking for and what the finance org is looking for.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, I appreciate you joining us today and giving this insight to this group. This is a question we get all the time from a variety of organizations that reach out to us and want to make that move to the cloud. So I hope everyone who attended found it as valuable as we did. Thanks so much, Chris.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you for being here. We really do appreciate it. Take this good information and share this, and hope that you go make it a great day. Tell a friend about ROK and Directions Magazine. Thanks, everybody.